They weren't supposed to come here. Not after the war. Not after everything that had been uncovered. The names were known. The records existed. The evidence was undeniable. And yet, they were brought in anyway. Not publicly. Not officially. Quietly. Carefully. Rewritten. At the end of World War II, the United States began a program that wasn't announced. Not debated. Not explained. It was simply carried out. The goal was clear. Acquire knowledge. Not just documents. Not just research. People. Scientists. Engineers. Specialists who had worked for one of the most dangerous regimes in modern history. Many of them had been involved in programs that crossed ethical lines. Human experimentation, weapon development, technologies designed for destruction. But their knowledge was valuable, too valuable to ignore. And so, Operation Paperclip began. On paper, it was about national security, about staying ahead, about preventing rival nations from gaining access to the same expertise. But the process required something else, something more complicated. Their pasts had to be adjusted. Records were altered. Histories rewritten. Details removed, so they could be brought into a new system, a different country, a different identity. Many of these individuals were placed into high-level positions, government programs, research facilities, military development, working alongside the very nation that had once been their enemy. And for years, it remained largely unknown, hidden behind classification, until fragments began to surface. Documents, reports, names that didn't belong where they were found, and questions began to form, not just about what had been done, but about who had been allowed to continue. Because if the past had been rewritten once, what else had been changed? What else had been overlooked? Some argued it was necessary. A strategic move in a world that was shifting rapidly. Others saw it differently. A compromise. A decision that blurred the line between victory and consequence. Because the knowledge that was gained came from somewhere, and the methods used to obtain it didn't simply disappear. They were absorbed, continued, refined, under a different system with different oversight, or perhaps less oversight. That's where the uncertainty begins. Because once those individuals were integrated, their work didn't stop. It evolved. New projects, new research, new developments, some of which would go on to define entire fields. Space exploration, advanced weapon systems, biological research, technologies that shaped the modern world. But the origin of that knowledge remained connected to something else, something that had never been fully addressed. And that raises a question. If the foundation of certain advancements came from methods that were never publicly reconciled, then what does that mean for the systems built on top of them? And who decides which parts of history are acknowledged and which are quietly removed? Because Operation Paperclip wasn't just about bringing people into a new country. It was about transforming their past into something acceptable, something usable. And once that process begins, it doesn't stop easily. Records can be changed, narratives adjusted, but the truth doesn't disappear. It just becomes harder to trace and harder to question, because the more time passes, the more those details fade into the background, replaced by outcomes, by achievements, by progress. But behind that progress, there are layers. Decisions that were made quickly, quietly, without public awareness. And if those decisions were made once, under those conditions, then what prevents them from happening again? Because the idea of rewriting the past for the sake of the future isn't limited to one moment in history. It's a method, and methods don't disappear. They adapt. And if they adapt, then where are they being used now? And who is making those decisions today? And this wasn't the only program where individuals were brought in despite what was known about them, because somewhere else, another operation was underway, one that followed a similar pattern, but led to very different outcomes. And this wasn't the only time history was quietly rewritten behind the scenes, because somewhere else, something even harder to explain was already happening. There's also the issue of integration, because bringing individuals into a system isn't just about relocation. It's about absorption, taking knowledge developed elsewhere and embedding it into new structures, new programs, new objectives, which means the origin of that knowledge doesn't disappear. It continues, just under different direction, different control. And that creates overlap between past and present, because the work doesn't reset. It evolves. Then there's the question of oversight, because operations like this don't exist in full visibility. They're compartmentalized, information separated, access limited, which means not everyone involved understands the full scope. Only parts, fragments, enough to perform a role, not enough to see the entire system. And that structure reduces accountability, because responsibility becomes distributed, difficult to trace, difficult to assign. There's also the long-term effect, because decisions made in one period don't stay there. They extend forward, influencing future programs, future research, future direction. And once something is introduced, it becomes part of the foundation, built on, expanded, without always revisiting how it started.